Hello, welcome back to Kim Reads. We'll continue with The Bad Seed. Chapter 7. Afterward, Christine felt relief, as though Miss for uncertainty had dissipated her own doubts, and during the next day she went about her duties of preparing meals, sewing, and looking out for her child and her house. She went to an afternoon wedding with Mrs. Breedlove, where both wept a little behind their handkerchief. She shopped for an old-fashioned, hard-haired mattress that Kenneth wanted for his bed. She went to dance given by the treasurer of her husband's company for his nieces from New Orleans. She was determined to deny her fears, to forget her uncertainties, and she did so as long as she kept herself busy or was with others. But at night, with Rhoda asleep in the house so quiet that vibration and sound were magnified in her mind, her doubts came back to trouble her. She awoke one morning thinking if she did not take care of herself in hand, she did not make a great effort at self-control. She soon became as overawed as Mrs. Daigle. It occurred to her that if she questioned Rhoda's normality, if there were true grounds for her feelings that the child had criminal traits, she should no longer avoid the issue. It was her duty. If her fears were grounded, the fact to educate herself, to read and study the things she avoided in the past. She accepted any reality that faced her, no matter how unpleasant, with courage and resourcefulness to remedy the situation if possible. If not, to make the best compromise she could with the facts. It's only through knowledge that she could help her child, could guide her with both understanding and intelligence to more acceptable attitudes toward more conventional goals. Her mind automatically turned to Reginald Tasker, to the talks they had together. She had wanted to telephone him instantly, to ask his guidance. She already doubted that undermined her good sense a little, and she felt fearful at doing so, as though she would guess the true motive of her interest. Then, although she despised her guilty deviousness, she decided to handle the matter another way. She'd give a cocktail party and ask him to it, along with other guests whom she was not momentarily interested in at all. She'd make an opportunity to be alone with him, and she'd ask him with misleading casualness, as though the matter had just occurred to her, to advise her in the reading. Certainly, under those circumstances, he would attribute no motive to her except the idleness of her mind, but if he did, she'd be forced into uncover other untruth. She'd tell him she was thinking of trying her hand at a novel, now that Kenneth was away, and time hung so heavily on her hands. She gave a party on the last day of June. She arranged that Rhoda stay with Mrs. Forsyth across the hall, but Rhoda wanted to come in for a little while to meet her mother's guest. Christine consented, and when all the guests were there, Mrs. Forsyth brought in the child. Rhoda was dressed in white lawn embroidered in yellow, a frock her mother had made for her a few days before. She wore white shoes and yellow socks, and her hangman braids were looped back with little yellow bows. The guests were enchanted with her. She smiled her hesitant, charming smile. She curtsied in a manner Miss Forsyth had recently taught her. She listened with solemn intensity when she was complimented, her eyes wide and innocent of guile. She was polite, dignified, and serious. When Mrs. Forsyth said they must leave, she nodded gravely, and when making the soft sound around a contented and pampered animal makes, she ran to her mother and embraced her with calculated spontaneity, and then smiling again, she looked down in modesty, her shallow dimple plain for all to see. She held Miss Forsyth's hand, pressed close to her thigh for protection, and left with her. When the child was gone and her guest no longer needed her attention, Christine went to Reginald and said that since time at Monaga, when he told the story of Nurse Dennison, she found herself more and more interested in his field. She even read accounts of the Ponder trial. Then, touching her arm, her head tilted to one side and lowered in gracious surrender of her to his. She said that she never knew such shocking things if he had not first introduced them to them. And wasn't he ashamed of himself for going town corrupting old married ladies? Reginald said he wasn't in the least ashamed. On the contrary, it was one of the things he boasted about in his old age, or used in expanded and flattering version in his memoirs. Behind them on the balcony, his voice coming through with shrill clarity, an intellectual young man said, "A great novelist with something to say has no concerns with style or oddity of preparation. Now, take a man like Tolstoy. I've just read Anna again. Tolstoy had no fear of the obvious. He wallowed in platitudes. That's why his work survived." Christine said, "The last time we talked about crimes, it was about crimes children commit. You said, although I found it hard to believe, that it wasn't rare for children to commit major crimes. You said the ones destined to become famous in their field almost always began young. Were you serious, or were you taking advantage of my innocence?" "Well, I never thought of Tolstoy as dealing in platitudes. Dickens, yes, but hardly Tolstoy." Reginald said he had been serious indeed. There was a type of criminal he was particularly interested in. The type was his specialty. For a long time now, he'd been clipping and saving reported cases and making notes for a sustained study of the type. In this sort of criminal, which seemed different from all the others, there seemed to be as many women as men, which was unusual to begin with. His hype, if they weren't too stupid or too unlucky, ended up as murderers on a grand scale. They never killed for reasons that so often sway swarm but foolish humans. They never killed for passion, since they always seemed incapable of feeling it, or jealousy, or thwarted love, or even revenge. There seemed to be no element of sexual cruelty in them. They killed for two reasons only: for profit, since all they had was an unquenchable thirst for possessions, and for the elimination of danger when their safety was threatened. "I'm very interested," said Christine. "Will you let me look at your material? I'll take very good care of it." Mrs. Breedlove, a martini in her hand, moved through the crowd and came closer to them. She stood listening in a sort of a dramatic astonishment, and then she impulsively said, "But, dear Christine, what's come over you? Why have you done such an about-face?" Christine smiled self-consciously and said, "I doubt if there is a reason." Mrs. Breedlove shook her head in patient denial, sat between them, and said, "There's a reason, dear Christine. There's a sound psychological reason for everything we do, if we can only find it." Then, with seeming appropriateness, she said, "When I was in analysis with Dr. Kettlebaum, I used to go early, having such a positive transference to the poor man. There was an attractive young Englishman who preceded me, and we met in the waiting room quite often. Sometimes when Dr. Kettlebaum was tied up on the phone between patients and late wasn't calling me, we walked together. This young man, I've forgotten his name years ago, which is sympathetic too, you'll soon see, once told me that he considered me unusually attractive, except for one detail. I'll be his idea," he said. "His temperament was an odd one, you see. He said he adored only one-legged women, and I plainly had two." Reginald whistled between his teeth and said, "Boy, is that a new slant." Monica continued, "So I said to him, I'll admit you're very handsome. I'll even go further and say you've got the nicest eyelashes I've ever saw in a man. Do you think I'm going to cut off my leg to please you? Superior though you may be, you're dreadfully mistaken, my dear." Reginald and Christine laughed to the same instant, and Mrs. Breedlove, herself giggling in memory, continued. "So this young man with odd taste stared at me in that composed manner the British have perfected and said, 'I didn't expect it, I assure you.' But where did he find one-legged women?" asked Christine. "My dear," said Monica. "My dear, our minds are so in accord. Now that's precisely what I asked him to. But he looked at me in the completest astonishment and said, 'Find them? My dear lady, the problem is, how do you avoid them? London is full of one-legged women, as you surely noticed. You see them everywhere you go.'" There was silence, and Christine said, "Is that moral meant for me? Is that the eyes find what the mind is seeking?" "But of course," said Mrs. Breedlove, who went on to say that she always considered Mrs. Penmark's unwillingness to accept sordid or criminal data as symptomatic. In other words, she regarded it as a positive wish concealed under a negative reaction. It meant really, for the time, she had been emotionally unable to examine with necessary detachment her drives towards hate and destruction, but now with anxiety so plainly abated, she was able to do it at last. On the whole, she was pleased with Christine's preoccupation with crime, with her new, more wholesome attitude. It indicated a wider audience, a greater maturity than she had before. She turned and looked searchingly at her friend, and in confusion, Christine gave the explanation she prepared in advance that explained she was later to use so often in justification of her actions. There was always a desire at the back of her mind to write a novel, although she doubted that she could really pull it off. Nevertheless, the things she'd heard from Reginald were so fresh, so off the beaten path, or so they seemed to her, that she attempted to use them in the autobiographical book she was turning over in mind, a book being reinforced and supported by the details of actual cases. She stopped with sudden wariness, thinking, why did I say an autobiographical book? That's strange, I think. She waited for Mrs. Breedlove to catch after her on the ship, but since she did not, she got up and said she must go now and see to her other guests. It was then that Reginald offered to lend Mrs. Penmark the court he collected. He digested many of the cases and had them sorted them roughly into the categories. His own book, if he ever got around to doing it, would be factual, so there would be conflict. He asked if she decided on a plot for a novel, if she worked out any of the details. She said she had not. She only knew in a general way that the novel would be about a mass murders and her disastrous effort, not only by the victims by violence, but on those who survived her. There wasn't much to go on, she knew, but it was all she worked out so far. The following morning, Mrs. Forsythe suggested as a special treat that she and Rhoda go to the corner and have ice cream soda together. She was a thin, tall woman in her late 60s, but with wide, flat hips and sloping shoulders. She had been a great beauty in her time, the perfect Gibson girl, Mrs. Breedlove said, and she still wore her streaked fair hair in a variant form of the pompadour of her triumphant days, a smaller, less imposing, more rounded pompadour with a tight, solid knot at its center, so that the effect now was that of a cushion held in place by a paperweight. She said that the child came out of the door together, and Rhoda saw Leroy waiting for her near the sidewalk. All at once he thought of a new way to tease her, a variant method of showing his enamored hatred of the child. The idea seemed both subtle and witty to him. He went to the basement and took a dead rat from the cage where it had been since morning. He tied a bow around the neck's end and put it in one of Christmas boxes he saved. Then, wrapping the box in colored paper and tying it with Christmas ribbon, he had it ready when the child returned. He winked knowingly when Mrs. Forsythe's back was turned and made a suggestive gesture for the back of the building. But the child ignored him. She remained standing on the flat stones, as though she waited some more explicit explanation, and as the old lady went up to the steps, paused and fumbled in her untidy handbag for her keys. Leroy came closer and hummed softly, as though he were serenading the little girl. I got a real nice present. Yes, I got a real nice present. I got a present I've been saving all for you. Rhoda nodded, and he went to the basement, standing inside the door where he couldn't have been seen. Rhoda joined him quickly, and he sent her a whisper, which was unnecessary, since there was nobody to go near him. I figure you and me ought to be really good friends. So I got you a present to make up all the mean things I already said to you. When I seen this present I'm talking about, I thought right away of you. I said, that present sure makes me think of Rhoda Penmark. What is it, Leroy? What'd you get me? Open it. Just open it, you see. The child opened the box. She lifted her head and stared at Leroy with a particular faraway look in her eyes. Leroy laughed and sat down on the bed, overcome with the wittiness of his gesture, but he laughed guardedly, as though he and the child were involved together in a conspiracy which must never be revealed. You know what your presents remind me of? He asked when he got to his breath again. It reminds me of Claude lying dead in his coffin. He waited for the child's response, but since there was none, he went on. I thought of first getting you some sweet-smelling flowers, but I didn't have time to go to the graveyard and steal some off of Claude's grave. Rhoda got up, but Leroy, catching her hand, detained her. Tell me one thing, now that we're good friends again. Did you find that bloody stick you washed off for good? If you didn't, you better hurry up and find it. I might get mad at you again and tell the police to go look for it. That afternoon, Reginald called the Penmark apartment to leave the cases he opened. Clipped to each case was a digest of its particular contents and often his own comments, too. When Rhoda was in the apartment park reading, Christine took up one of the folders and read 3 cases marked, Young, simple situation, offenders not too bright, caught early. Raymond Walsh, a 16-year-old boy, shot his even younger friend to death for a few dollars. Beulah Honeycutt and Norman Jean Brooks, both young girls, killed a farmer who had befriended them for the $2 he had in the pocket. Milton Drury murdered his mother and set her on fire for the money she carried on her person. There was a note in Reginald's handwriting attached to the folder that contained, as he said, these simple and, in a sense, relatively wholesome cases. They all acted with great stupidity. No. They'd all been caught young, perhaps at the beginning of their careers. Greed, he felt, was the driving power behind them. All the Coleman and Ames are their kind. None had any concept of human morality. None was able to understand loyalty, affection, gratitude, or love. They were cold, pitiless, and entirely selfish. Perhaps the general type could have been more seen clearly in these simple kindergarten cases than in the more elaborate cases to be dealt with later on. Mrs. Penmark sighed, lit a cigarette, and put her folder down, leaving the other cases in it unread. She went to her window, knelt on the seat there, and looked for a long time, and at the green, untroubled street, the trees shimmering in the hot sun of July, and then coming back to her chair, she read again. There were cases concerned with more experienced practitioners, people who were perhaps more intelligent than the first group, but not too much so. At least they'd been lucky for a time, and they were perfecting their various techniques when caught. Tilly Klemek of Illinois poisoned 5 husbands for their insurance. Houston Roberts of Mississippi murdered his 2 wives and one of his grandchildren for the profit involved in their death. He tried to murder a second grandchild, but she recovered and he was caught. Daisy Dilmecker of South Africa was a poisoner for gain on a major scale. She was executed at last for the murder of her son, whom she assured for $500. Mrs. Penmark put away the case in her desk, went to her back window, and called her daughter into lunch. Rhoda slowly walked down the park, but as she passed the basement door, Leroy stuck his head out and said, "When the policemen find that stick and make it turn blue, they're going to put you in the electric chair. They're going to fry you out real slow. You ever seen your mama cook bacon and watch it swivel up? That's what they're going to do to you in that electric chair. You're going to turn brown and you're going to swivel all over." "The electric chair is too big for me," said Rhoda. "I wouldn't fit in it." "That's what you think," said Leroy laughingly. "Now let me tell you something. They got a special chair for mean little girls like you. They got a little pink chair that's just your size. I've seen it plenty of times, miss. It's painted real pretty pink and it looks nice, but of course it don't look so nice to the little girls that's frying up like a pork chop inside it. What you said about making a stick turn blue was something you made up. You're not going to heaven you keep telling stories the way you do. You're going to be the bad place when you die, and that's where you're going, Leroy. Go on in the house and eat your lunch. Your mama told you not to talk to me no more, and she told me not to talk to you either, so I'm not going to talk to you no more. But you better find that stick is all I can say. I can tell you a lot of things you want to find out. But your mom said not to talk to you no more. Go into the house and quit bothering me. When she had gone, Leroy lay on his improved back thinking of his cleverness. He knew how to manage that one now. He was sure that mean little girl... He sure had that mean little girl worried, and worried good. Wouldn't be long before she jumped and fidgeted when he spoke to her. Just wait and see if she didn't. Rhoda came to her apartment and ate her lunch, and then after she practiced her piano lesson, she said casually to her mother, "Is it the truth that the blood has been washed off anything a policeman can tell there if he puts powder on the place? Will the place really turn blue? Who's been talking to you about such things, Leroy?" "No, Mother, it wasn't him. You told me not to talk to Leroy. It was some men I heard talking about it when they passed the park gate." Mrs. Penmark said she didn't know anything about bloodstains, although she'd call Uncle Reginald, who was an authority on these matters, if really wanted to know. But Rhoda suddenly shook her head and said, "No." It was then Christine went back to the kitchen. She finished her lunch and dishes there. But her suspicions were now aroused, and she wondered why the child had asked her such a strange question. For she knew now, and had known for a long time, that Rhoda asked nothing idly, for the pleasure of hearing her own voice, as other children did. Later, she saw Rhoda go to the bedroom and came out with a parcel wrapped paper, and then, after looking casually about her to see what she observed, she opened at the door to the back hall and shut it noisily behind her. Mrs. Penmark cracked her kitchen door, which also opened to the back hall, and watched her daughter with both curiosity and fear. And then when she saw the child approach the incinerator chute, she hurried down the hall in pursuit, caught by her daughter by the arm, blocked the incinerator with back, and said, "What have you got in that package? Give it to me, Rhoda. Give it to me at once." "I haven't gotten anything, Mother." "There's something you wanted to burn. Give it to me." She took the parcel from the sullen child. She guided it to back to the apartment door. But Rhoda pulled away from her in unpredictable panic, suddenly began biting and kicking like some insane trapped animal. In her surprise, as the child's sharp teeth sank into her wrist, Mrs. Penmark dropped the parcel, and Rhoda watched, snatched it, and ran down the hall. She had her hand on the lid of her chute when her mother caught it to her. And again, Christine wrestled the package from the struggling child. Rhoda stood quietly when she knew she was defeated, and she stared at her mother with such cold, forgiving hatred that Christine's hand automatically lifted and pressed against her heart as though she knew the scene were unendurable to her. Then making little primitive animal sounds, the child flew at her mother again, as though she'd lost control of her senses. This time, Mrs. Penmark seized the little girl and shook her by the shoulders, her bangs rising and falling, her thin, immature neck swaying back and forth. She shoved the child before her, entered her living room, and opened the parcel. And there, just as she'd known it would be, were the cleated shoes Rhoda had worn to the picnic, but had not worn since. Christine said, "I now know why you were so interested in blood. You hit Claude with your shoe, didn't you?" She was surprised at the calmness of her voice, how impersonally she was able to act this moment in the face of such dreadful knowledge. "You hit him with the shoe, didn't you?" she repeated. "Tell me the truth. Tell me the truth." Rhoda did not answer immediately. She glanced wearily at Christine, her mind busy even with the plans to bend her mother once more to her will, to win her approval and loyalty again. "I now know there's no sense in lying anymore," said Mrs. Penmark. "You hit him with the shoe. That's how those half-moon marks got on his foreheads and hands." Rhoda moved off slowly, an expression of patient bafflement in her eyes. Then, throwing herself on the sofa, she buried her face in the pillow and wept plaintively, peering at her mother through the lace fingers. But the performance was not at all convincing, and Christine looked back at her child with a new, dispassionate interest and thought, she's an amateur so far, but she's improving day by day. She's perfecting her act. In a few years, it won't seem corny at all. It'll be most convincing then, I'm sure. Answer me, she said, some anger. Answer me. The child, seeing was not impressing her mother, got up from the sofa, walked leisurely to Christine, and stood before her. I hit him with the shoe, she said calmly. I had to hit him with the shoe, Mother. What else could I do? Mrs. Penmark's anger mounted, and the desperation of her panic. She slapped the child so hard across her face that she staggered backward and fell into one of the big, fat, overstuffed chairs, her bare legs stiff and straight before her. Mrs. Christine pressed her palms against her forehead, feeling sick and frightened. She sat down to compose herself when her anger had vanished, and there was only left a feeling of nausea in her stomach, a sense of unreality in her mind. She said wearily, do you understand that you murdered the boy? It was his fault, said Rhoda patiently. It was all Claude's fault, not mine. If he had given me the medal like I told him to, I wouldn't have hit him. She began to cry, pressing her forehead against the arm of the chair. It was Claude's fault, she said. It was his fault. Christine closed her eyes and said, tell me what happened. I want the truth this time. I know you killed him, so there's no sense lying again. Start from the beginning and tell me how it happened. Rhoda threw herself into her mother's arms and said, I won't do it again, Mother. I won't ever do it again. Christine wiped the child's eyes, brushed down her bangs, and said quietly, I'm waiting for her answer. Tell me. I must know now. He wouldn't give me the medal like I told him to, that's all. So then he ran away from me and hid on the wharf. But I found him there, and I told him I'd hit him with my shoe if he didn't give me the medal. He shook his head and said, no. So I hit him the first time. Then he took off the medal and gave it to me like I asked him to. What happened then? Well, he tried to run away, so I hit him with the shoe again. He kept crying and making a noise. I was afraid somebody would hear him, so I hit him, Mother. I hit him harder this time, and he fell in the water. Christine closed her eyes and said, oh my God, oh my God. The little girl was crying harder now, her mouth twisted with her apprehension. I didn't take the medal. Claude gave it to me when I asked him for it. But after he gave it to me, he said he was going to tell Miss Octavia I took it from him, and that she'd make me give it back. That's why I hit him after the first time. Mrs. Penmark thought, what must I say? What must I do now? Suddenly the child wiped away her tears, embraced her mother, and said coquettishly, oh, I've got the prettiest mother. I've got the nicest mother. That's what I tell everybody. I say I've got the sweetest. How did the Brutuses get on the back of his hands, Rhoda? He tried to pull himself back on the wharf after he fell in the water. I wouldn't have hit him anymore, except that he kept saying he was going to tell on me. So I hit him on the hands to make him loose on the wharf. But he wouldn't turn loose right away, no matter how hard I hit him, Mother. So I had to hit him on the head some more, and on the hand some more, too. I hit him the hardest of all that time, and that's how I got blood on my shoe. So finally, he closed his eyes and turned off loose on the wharf like I told him to. But it was all his fault, Mother. He shouldn't have said he was going to tell on me, should he? Okay, so she said that she hit him because he wouldn't give him the medal like he told him to. But I think she would have done it regardless, because she would have had to have done something to keep him from talking. Then, remembering what Leroy had told her, the child cried again, but in the fright this time going out between her sobs. Are they going to put me in the chair and turn on the electricity? She came closer to her mother and said, it wasn't my fault Claude got drowned. It was his fault. Christine walked to the room in an aimless panic, her hands pressing against her cheeks. The child clung to her mother's waist and said, trembling with sudden terror, you won't let me put me in the chair, will you? Mother, you won't let me hurt you? Christine stopped suddenly, turned to the frightened child and said, nobody will hurt you. I don't know what must be done now, but I promise nobody will hurt you. In relief, the child wiped her eyes. She smiled in her old manner, her dimples showing affectionately. She went through all her charming antics for her mother, and she said at length at her small, ingenuous voice, "If I give you a basket of kisses, what will you give me?" "Please," said Christine, "please. Give me the answer, Mother. If I give you a basket of kisses, what will you?" "Go to your room and read," said Mrs. Primark harshly. Then in a weary voice she said, "I want to think. I must decide what's to be done." But even as she spoke, she knew she was unable, in that moment of stress, either to make the decisions now inevitable for her required attitudes for her child, or to formulate the plans necessary to put in motion such decision, even if made. Her mind no longer moved in the straight line of rational thought. It turned out like a rotating wheel in rapid, intense circles of emotion, when she seemed unable to escape. The things the child had confessed repeatedly themselves over and over in a heat, inaudible patter in her car, in her ear. She had wanted to assuage her doubts, to know the truth, and now she did know. When she dreaded the fantasy so long, then faced an unalterable reality. And now that she did know, she comforted herself, even in this moment of turmoil, with the certainty that no matter how dreadful the truth had been, at least she could no longer torture herself with half-knowledge, or at least at her mind with doubt. And after a time, she came to her child's room and said, "Why don't you go to the park and play? I want to be alone. I must think what's best for both of us." She added, that as Rhoda nodded and smiled and approached the door, "You must promise me you won't tell anybody else what you told me. It's very important. Do you understand? Do you?" But seeing the tolerant, contemptuous look in her daughter's eyes, she felt suddenly and experiencing a little gush. Her voice wavered and ceased, for she knew her warning only betrayed the depth of her amateurish ineptness, and there was no chance that whatever Rhoda would easily reveal what she'd done. Then, wearily, while the child stood in amusement before her, though awkwardly submissive, she always said, "How did you manage it with the old lady in Baltimore? I know so much now, another thing won't matter greatly." And Rhoda, sure of her triumph, smiled and said meekly, "I shoved her, Mother. I shoved her a little." When her child had gone, she went to the bathroom, her purpose not clear in her mind. She stood there in indecision, but seeing her reflection in the mirror, she pointed her finger at her image and laughed shrilly. Then resting her head against the glass, her arms hang limply at her sides, and she knew she must live with her secret as best she could. She must optimistically hope for the best. She wanted more than anything to discuss her daughter with another, but she knew she could not. Certainly not at present time. It would be difficult even to tell Kenneth, as of course she inevitably must. Then, when the desire to confide was too strong for her to bear longer, she made a sort of left-hand compromise confession to Reginald Tasker. A confession she was sure he failed to interpret its worth. She telephoned him and said she'd been working steadily on the structure of her novel. She decided the book would have around a criminal child, a child not like any other, what the other murderers she'd been reading about once had been. "What about the mother? Is she going to be a criminal too?" "No, the mother will be commonplace and rather stodgy." "What's your conflict?" said Reggie. "When you figure out what you're going to do with it, let me know, will you?" They chatted for a time with people they both knew, and when they finished, Christine sat by the window, her hands resting in her lap. The wild spinning in her head had lessened now, and she forced her mind to consider the courses open to her in dealing with her daughter's future. The first thing to consider was the child's sanity. Was Rhoda actually insane, and as such not responsible for what she'd done? If she were insane, didn't she belong to some place where she'd be treated and perhaps cured? Where she'd be prevented at least from doing further harm to people? But almost at once she shook her head in denial. Rhoda was not insane, and anyone who knew her at all knew that well. But even if she were, even if she had And Kenneth agreed later on that was the best thing to do with her. How do you arrange such matters? Would Kenneth's family have to know? She shook her head helplessly. She did not know how things should be done. She got up suddenly and walked out of the apartment, arranging and rearranging her belongings without conscious thought, as though her actions were merely the outward mechanics of an inward turbulence she could not easily arrange. She told herself she'd read no more of the criminal cases. They would only serve now to enhance her anxieties, to deepen her depression, and then moving with detached precision of a walking toy, she began eagerly to read again, as if knowing somewhere reviewing these cases would point out to her sooner or later things she wanted to learn, would reveal some secret knowledge of her own life. Knowledge which she felt now she could no longer easily avoid. She read cases concerned about the work of her celebrated women mass murderers, all of whom had been interested in only profit in it for them. There was Mrs. Archer Gilligan, owner of a home for the aged, who took her guests on a lump sum life basis and who took the proper precautions to see that she did not go into the red. There was Belle Glennis of Indiana, who, after striking her admirers with a hatchet, was said to have chopped them up in a sort of silage and thriftily fed them to her pigs. There was Miss Bertha Hill, who lived in a village called Pleasant Valley. There was Christine Wilson, the English girl, who used colchium with such enthusiasm that the doctors of her day thought a new unknown epidemic had broken out in England. There was Mrs. Hahn, Mrs. Brennan, and Miss Jane Topham. There was Susie Ollo, who, almost unaided, practically wiped out the male population of 2 Hungarian villages. There was a series of cases involving male mass murderers. She only read one of them. Albert Guay, the Quebec jeweler, blew a plane, and the people in it to collect the trivial insurance he placed on the life of his wife. One of the passengers, there was a note attached to the Guay case. In Reginald's opinion, he'd leaped with 23 victims into the ranks of distinguished mass murderers, not through merit, but through accident. Compared with such outstanding artists as Alfred Klein, James P. Watson, or the incomparable Betsy Denker, he'd be fumbling and foolish indeed. Mrs. Pranmark laid aside the folder, stood beside her window that overlooked the park, and said in a puzzled voice, Betsy Denker, where have I heard that name before? She toyed with the cord of her Venetian blind, and after a moment, her lips, as though functioning without the proper knowledge of thought, shaped the words, Bessie Denker, August Denker, Emma Denker. And there was an old lady we called Cousin Ada Gustafson. In sudden panic, she called Rhoda from the park, and when the child stood before her, she said harshly, Take those shoes and put them in the incinerator. The child moved away to obey her, and Christine called out in a shrill, agonizing voice, Hurry, Rhoda, hurry! Put them in the incinerator and burn them quickly. She stood beside her door, watching while the little girl went down the hall, lowered the chute, and dropped the blood-stained shoes into the furnace below. And that's the end of that chapter. See you later.